I joined HMS Hood in July 1939, having previously served in the cruiser Sheffield and in a destroyer flotilla in the Home Fleet. At the time, I joined with two friends who had served with me as midshipmen, Midshipman Pryor and Midshipman Chappell, and we left our various ships and went to Portsmouth to join Hood, which was at that time berthed in Portsmouth Dockyard. We went together, went into the dockyard and saw HMS Hood, which was then the biggest warship in the world. And we weren't terribly pleased because midshipmen, on the whole, did not particularly like going to big ships. Service in small ships was much more interesting. But we reckoned that this was nothing we could do about it. And so I joined with these two. And when we went close to Hood, which was alongside the dockyard, and we looked at it, we saw this huge, great ship, the longest and the biggest warship in the world, and thought, oh my God, I wonder how many midshipmen there are serving in this. We'll be in a gun room of probably 20 to 24 midshipmen. Before we actually went up the gangway, we noticed that there was an officer pacing up and down the quarterdeck with a telescope under his arm, and we recognized him as Lieutenant Commander Jessel, who had been, for me and for the other two, the first naval officer we had ever encountered when we joined the Navy as cadets, the 8 months before. Jessel, at that time, was a most ferocious-looking chap. He was big and heavy, bushy eyebrows, curly black hair, and lurched around when walking because his previous appointment has been as captain of the destroyer, which was escorting the then King Edward VIII and Mrs. Simpson on a nice yachting holiday in the Adriatic. And he had been with them on water skiing or surfboarding, as it was then called, and when trying to get back on board the little towing skimmer, his foot got in contact with a propeller and made a mess of one of his feet, so that he had a huge boot and lurched. And we thought, oh my God, having had this fearsome man as our training officer in the first training ship, Erebus, don't say we have to serve with him again. I then said, I hope he's not the snotty's nurse, which is the officer is appointed by the captain of the ship to make sure that the midshipmen behave themselves and do their job. My fears were not realized because I then found that Jessel was going to be was appointed as first lieutenant, and the snotty's nurse responsible for the discipline of the midshipmen was a nice, quiet, gentlemanly fellow. That did not make much difference because Jessel, a very loud man, still was I had to understudy him when any work was done on the anchors and cables up in the bow of the ship. And one thing he refused to do was communicate with the bridge of the ship and the captain by telephone. He shouted from the very eyes of the ship up to the bridge to the captain, and the captain, who was also a large, loud man, had to shout back. Telephone became completely redundant with these two working. So I joined and found that my first duty was absolutely marvellous. I was appointed, when in harbour, to run the second steam picket boat, which was a lovely thing with a funnel and a crew, and I worked with another man 1 day on, 1 day off to do duties when that picket boat was in harbour. And I had a coxswain who was an acting petty officer, 3 able seamen, and 1 boy who went with the fender, and a stoker petty officer to work in the engine room, and a stoker to look after the boiler. And I thought I couldn't have had a more interesting job to do in harbour. My memory of the Hood was mainly the joy of driving this steam picket boat round. My opposite number, who worked with me on a 24-hour on and 24-hour off, was not so fortunate. When it was his turn one day when we were in Scapa Flow, he was detailed to go right across the flow from the anchorage towards Kirkwall to collect something, and miserable night, and coming back he got a little bit lost and ended up by running ashore on a small island of Flotta. He was not the most popular man in the Hood, because this put this second picket boat out of action for several weeks while the shipwrights got busy in repairing it. Fortunately, it wasn't my day, so he was the one who got the blame. I was on the 24-hour off duty. At sea, I also got a plum job. I was appointed as one of the watchkeepers in what was then called the Plot, which was stationed one deck below the compass platform or the bridge and on the Admiral's deck. And I worked on a 3-watch system with the instructor commander and the warrant schoolmaster, and keeping the Plot, which assisted the navigator, because it was an automatic table, to keep the position of the ship right. Now this was in the days before radar, so there wasn't very much information having to be subscribed into the Plot. The longest thing we had to do, and I was on watch on my own sometimes, was to plot the through a signal, the air searches by RAF Coastal Command, so that I could inform the bridge that we may be sighting a Coastal Command aircraft because we're crossing its track. I thought this was a very, very interesting job, so that I was well occupied with the job I had to do in harbour and what I had to do at sea. When I was off duty from the picket boat, if it was my picket boat which was in the water, and there was another picket boat which another 2 midshipmen took charge of, those days I attended what we called school under the instructor commander, who taught us theoretical navigation and other theory jobs. And it was, I was very, very pleased, and also I had other ship's duties in the division, the forecastle division, which was a quarter of the ship's company, and it was a huge ship's company, and I assisted the divisional officer of the forecastle division in any divisional work which he had to do with his seamen. And so, because I had this wonderful job in harbour of running the picket boat, I was quite well resolved that I had been appointed to the largest ship in the world, and that my fears of joining a big ship as opposed to a small ship evaporated. So I was very happy to carry on and do that job. What our conditions were that all midshipmen slept in the midshipmen's locker room, and we slept in hammocks. And of course a hammock is a very useful thing and is perfectly warm and perfectly safe so long as you get into it and get out of it safely, and was much better than a bunk because the hammock swung with any rolling that the ship did. The hammock, we had the privilege as young officers, midshipmen, although we were a pretty low form of animal life, we had the privilege of having our hammock lashed up after Reveille by someone, a boy from the boys' division, and we had to pay him so much a week to do this job. This allowed us to get out of bed, go and wash, and some of us were in a shaving state, others didn't have anything to shave. We could then go and take part in the thing while the hammock boy lashed up our hammock and put it in the hammock stowage. This was a privilege which we very much appreciated. We had a locker, didn't have a cabin. Our clothing was in the locker. Nothing could be hung up, so even our uniform, our best uniform, had to be folded neatly and put into the drawers of a locker, which was had several drawers and was about 5 foot high, and about 24 midshipmen all had these lockers, all in one place. The midshipmen had a separate wash place, and this was always a scrummage in the morning, because if you had nearly 24 midshipmen all trying to wash and some trying to shave before the first muster at 0600 in the morning, you can imagine that it was all a bit of a scrum, and we had to be up there when all the seaman hands joined together to the traditional scrub decks. After breakfast, we could in fact go back, if we were quick, go and have another shot at the washroom. But that was, you took your chance of getting a place. There weren't many basins, and with 24 young chaps all trying to wash at the same time, it was sometimes it could be a bit of a scrum. I had a shower, no bath, a shower only, and the number of basins if you were a shaver, was not 24, so you sometimes had to wait before you could get in front of a basin and a mirror. There was plenty of hot water. That was no problem at all. We messed in the gun room, which all the midshipmen messed in the gun room, which contained the midshipmen, and the supervisor in the gun room from mess duty was the sub-lieutenant, who was appointed as a special job to be in charge of midshipmen from a domestic point of view, as opposed to an instructor in seamanship. We were lucky to have a very sensible sub-lieutenant, and I think we got on fairly well with him. I still was with the two chaps I'd been with in the two previous ships, Prior and Chapel, and if we went ashore at all, and we didn't have much time for going ashore because the war was about to begin, I would probably go with him and examine some of the pubs round Portsmouth. From the domestic point of view, midshipmen messed in the gun room under the supervision of the senior midshipman, of which I wasn't, and the sub-lieutenant. And we had a messman, a petty officer steward, who organised the feeding, and I thought the grub was fairly good, with no complaints at all about it. We paid a small mess bill into the ship in order to subsidise the messman, so we got perhaps better food. In fact, we did get much better food than the lower deck, which was the people who were not officers. So I had no complaint about the grub. I knew most of the men in the forecastle division by name, because it was my job to work with them if they were given tasks by their division officer. And I got on fairly well with most of them and carried out my duties when these ship's duties when it was not my turn to be running my second picket boat. On the question of its main armament of 8 15-inch guns, while I was in Hood, we never fired these guns in anger. We fired them for practice, and if they normally fired with 8 guns in 4 turrets, they normally went in salvos, firing 4 from the right gun, or say the right gun of each turret, and then that would go to be reloaded, and the left gun would go. With 4 guns going off all at once, the noise and the shaking was absolutely shattering. I would be in my action station in the plot, together with the instructor commander and the schoolmaster, who were the other 2 men who worked with me on a watch system of 4 hours. The people who would more or less get the actual noise were mainly those on the bridge and on the secondary armament, which was mainly anti-aircraft. They were on the open deck, on the top deck, and of course would get the actual noise, the direct noise of the guns firing. You could see the shell. If there was a clear day, you could in fact, working towards the target, you could see the 4 shells coming out from 2 from the forward turrets and 2 from the after turrets. And if it was a clear day, you could in fact see the 4 shells going away from you towards the target. But in practice, the shells didn't have any explosive. They were filled with sand. So you didn't get any explosion when they arrived. When they landed on the sea, you just got a splash. You could see them. But the range, of course, was, well, depending on what range captain wanted to exercise the ship for. But we didn't have many exercises with the 15-inch guns. We had more. Occasionally, we had actual firing at aircraft with the anti-aircraft guns, which were much smaller and on the upper deck, and they, of course, were in the open, but they did not make the shattering noise that the 15-inch guns did. On the famous occasion when the German Air Force claimed to have sunk the new aircraft carrier Ark Royal, Hood was in very close vicinity of the Ark Royal, but of course, the Germans did not, in fact, actually hit the Ark Royal at all. Some of their bombs landed very close to the Ark Royal, and Hood would perhaps be half a mile away from the Ark Royal at the time. That is the only case while I served in Hood when we had any action against the enemy. It was aircraft. Hood then went and joined the Home Fleet up in Scotland, either in the Firth of Forth or at Scapa Flow, where the job of the capital ships, the battleships, and the battle cruisers, of which Hood was one, were there to, when the war was declared, they were there to give cover to the northern blockade, which was a ring of converted merchant ships manned by Royal Naval Reserve and Merchant Navy, who were there to intercept any incoming or outgoing ships to and from Germany. And we went normally with the Hood plus sometimes another battleship or battle cruiser with a destroyer escort to be somewhere in the vicinity in case there was any sign of a German armed merchant ship getting in or coming out, or any merchant ship trading with Germany which had to be intercepted. This was the first winter of the war, and the weather was certainly not good, but we put up with it. And of course, when we came back to harbour, which will either be Scapa Flow or Loch Ewe or the Clyde, I then took on my job in the second picket boat if it was our turn. If not, if the first picket boat was doing duty, I did ordinary ship's duties and acted as midshipman of the watch and carried on, plus schooling with the instructor commander. We went out with the new French battleship Dunkirk, and that was very awful weather, and we didn't come into contact with the German radar, but we were escorted by British and for anti-submarine purposes by British and French destroyers, of which the French destroyers were much bigger than our destroyers and were able to keep, in the bad weather we had, keep station and keep speed much more effectively than the British destroyers. But we did not succeed in getting in contact with the German radar. In my memories of Hood and its tragic loss, at the time I didn't think that we were terribly at risk, and it didn't strike me at all that I was in a ship where the amount of armour protection in a section, the after section, had been reduced in order to comply with the reduction in sizes of ships. This, of course, happened to be tragic and was relevant to Hood's eventual destruction, because the after end of the ship, the quarterdeck, was very, very thinly protected, and in fact a lot of the officers had cabins under the quarterdeck, and they were put off, they were not used, and the officers who had those cabins had camp beds in the wardroom, the mess room. I could still get access to the midshipman's locker room, so we could get clothing there, but that wasn't so far as it wasn't right up to the stern part of the ship. When the hunt for the Bismarck was in, I was serving as third officer in the submarine Torbay, in the Mediterranean, and we just heard the BBC transmissions of same as what the British public knew, and we could only receive the BBC transmissions when we were on the surface at night. We could not receive BBC news, and therefore the ship's company would only get news of the sinking of the Hood and the eventual sinking of the Bismarck during the night. The news did not percolate very well, but the Admiralty did, in addition, also kept the fleet informed of what went on. I think it shattered me that the Hood, which, as I say, was the biggest warship in the world, could blow up in a matter of seconds with over 1,400 men all at once, and with 3 survivors. The interesting thing was that one of the survivors was a midshipman whose position at action stations was on the Admiral's Bridge, and the job that I had when at sea and as a watchkeeper. I didn't think much of that. I was too busy being third officer of a submarine, really, to worry about what had happened somewhere else in the Atlantic or in the home fleet. There's no doubt about it. It was the biggest instant casualty list of the whole war from the naval point of view. When the Royal Oak was sunk, the number was nothing like that. I served in the Hood until the spring of 1940, when I was due to do my sub-lieutenant's courses at the various schools in Portsmouth: gunnery, torpedo, signals, and navigation. And I left the Hood and did the courses and went on leave, and my 2 friends came with me with another 2 when we went and hired a yacht on the Norfolk Broads, and that was the end of my time in Hood. You say, while the British Army is fighting for its life, I was on this yacht in the Norfolk Broads, and when I started the courses in Portsmouth, I was interrupted on the courses because the British Army wasn't very successful in stopping the Germans invading France, and so on 2 occasions we were interrupted always in the middle of the night, to go to Portsmouth Barracks to be lined up to take small boats to places like Dunkirk, Le Havre, St. Valery, and so-and-so. I did not go to Dunkirk. I manned a Dutch coaster, of which there were 6 in Poole Harbour, and we took over, the naval crews took over, and my particular coaster, called the Jabba, went with 4 others to try and rescue some British Army soldiers from St. Valery.